What would you call this a box of? I know it's a little overexposed. What are these? Put them on boo-boos. What do you call those? Here I have a box of, and I got another box right here. What is that? Let me know what your name for those things are. So just kidding, those questions probably aren't terribly uncomfortable for anyone except a very unique segment of the population. But what's going to happen next is I'm going to say something which might be unsettling. D&D is like Kleenex.
What?
Pathfinder, Pathfinder 2, Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition, Old School Essentials, Hackmaster 4th Edition, D&D 3.x. They're all D&D. They're like Kleenex. They satisfy the same itch, fulfill the same need. They're all 0 to hero, high fantasy. They all have vancian spellcasting. You collect magic items and you slay monsters, and the characters advance in stochastic bursts, which we call levels. And there are, of course, a wide gulf of differences in playstyles and preferences between them. But ultimately, what are these games? I would put to you that all these games are essentially D&D. It's like Kleenex. Okay, level with you here. Why am I putting this kind of noise out here in the universe? Well, one is to say that people who play different kinds of D&D can still have conversations. They can still talk about D&D across these divides. And at the same time, you can live and let live. If someone's playing a different kind of D&D over there, and you prefer your kind of D&D, you can prefer different brands of D&D, still be part of the same thing. You both like to blow your nose with Kleenex, and you have something in common. Different strokes for different folks. So that's the utility of it from that perspective. The other reason that I feel like putting this awkward and perhaps even uncomfortable thought experiment out there into the universe is because I think it's a useful way of looking at how the entire universe of tabletop role-playing games, which are not Kleenex, are co-equal and do entirely different things. I've been seeing a number of interesting thoughts put out there. They were put out there on Twitter, and so I'm going to blur the names to conceal the identities of the folks who I'm in conversation with. But there are questions which are put as TTRPG questions and are really... they're basically D&D questions. The first of these examples asks the question of, what's the highest level campaign that you've ever been in? As if this is a sign of achievement. This is a sign of staying power and stamina for your group, and a sign of success. Notwithstanding the fact that there are different kinds of D&D where leveling up can be considerably more difficult and take more input hours of playtime in order to get to a given level. Now, I will be the very first to admit that I love asymmetric leveling tables, and old school D&D games make it so that a level 3 wizard has a good deal more experience points and has had to play a considerably longer time than a level 3 rogue. Part of this is because in an old school D&D game, the level 3 rogue is much more likely to get squished by a trap, while the wizard is a little bit more reticent to enter into battle and has a number of spells which can save his skin, not in the least of which is invisibility. My personal favorite. But I'm also not too proud to admit that these shades of difference are about as different as puffs plus lotion. The second example that I've got for you of this sort of D&D is the center of the universe, it does all things, not merely blow noses, thinking, is a question about resurrection magic. Intimation here is that TTRPGs in general have characters that come back to life. And in the comments and the replies, as people put it out there that there are other genres and games where characters don't come back to life, the replies, including from the author of the poll, seem to treat with those things as quaint. Like, why would you like that sort of thing? To me, this underlies an assumption that everything is like D&D. For me, character resurrection is a high fantasy trope. It's not really something that shows up in really any other kind of genre of fiction. And if tabletop role-playing games are something which you can experience many different kinds of genres through, then, you know, it's sort of projecting a lot. One example of this is that in Star Wars, people don't really come back to life. There is comic book death. Sometimes characters, they leave the show for a while, and it turns out that what we assumed to be their death is in fact just a hiatus, and they were severely injured, they were punished to obscurity, and they essentially stopped being a player character until they returned to the silver screen. It's not resurrection per se. There are other genres, especially Call of Cthulhu comes to mind, where the permanence of death is embedded and important to the insignificance of humanity in a cosmic horror scenario. You die, and the universe doesn't care, just like the game doesn't care. Another example of an RPG where character death is sort of morose and permanent is Traveler. The random character generation mechanics that underlie it also beget the idea that this is a special character, that these are some of the stakes, is that as you've gotten good or unique die rolls and generated a unique background that represents the particular person that you are embodying and piloting through this other universe, which is humanity's far future, that you have something to lose. However, this video is not a defense of the idea that permanent character death is important stakes in a game. It's just to say that if you rolled for a character, the value of that mechanic is embedded in the idea that your good rolls are not something that can be kept forever. A counterpart to this is that in Star Trek, death is very difficult, as in because of the transporter, because of the really beautiful and amazing medical technology which approaches the level of resurrection. It's a really morose and terrible thing when a character passes away, when they are dead, Jim. It's a real severe loss, and when red shirts give up their lives to preserve the lives of the main characters, a heavy weight falls upon them. And sometimes Captain Kirk expresses this in a peculiar fashion. Suffice it to say, the high fantasy trope of resurrection is something that it doesn't seem to have as much place in other genres of RPGs. And yet, other genres are part of the universe of tabletop role-playing games. I don't think that many strong D&D aficionados, even the forever D&D types that like to pat each other on the back and congratulate each other about how difficult it is to read other rule books, would say that other genres deserve to have lots of high fantasy interjected into them. And so I put to you that just as there are many different kinds of Kleenex, there are many different kinds of D&D. And sometimes I like to sample all those different flavors. I also like to get outside of the box. I don't just eat American food. Sometimes I put things on my palate, which are conceived and constructed around completely different core principles of cuisine. I'm going to go downstairs and I'm going to eat an amazing curry that my wife made the other night. And they're all co-equal. They're all food that real humans make and enjoy. So what do you think about this somewhat uncomfortable analogy, this Socratic poke, that perhaps D&D is like Kleenex? So what do you think about this uncomfortable, let's say Socratic analogy that D&D might be like Kleenex? You're welcome to disagree. I'm not even sure I agree with myself, but it's a thought experiment. And I think it's an important one to have with oneself, because I'm seeing more and more of high fantasy assumptions, zero to hero assumptions, and even normative assumptions that every RPG needs to have a campaign, that in order to be a really good game, it's got to go the distance. These are D&D assumptions, and they don't necessarily fit every shoe.